Um, without further ado, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what Protect Lane County Watersheds has been working on the last 5 years or so or more. One of the things that many of us who are working on this effort came from trying to stop aerial spraying in Lane County and in Oregon and everywhere, really. Aerial spraying is a practice that is part of which is part of clear-cut logging practices. And basically they'll come through, they'll clear cut a stand of trees, and then for a few years afterwards, they will come back through with helicopters and spray pesticides, which will not only get into the environment, get into the ecosystem, into animals that ingest it, but people will get drift from that spray, get into their bodies, people will get sick, and many people will die, including friends of ours and other activists who've worked on this issue. And not only that, but when rains come, all those chemicals, which are neurotoxins, will basically flow into our rivers and streams. So we've fought hard to try to stop that. And our effort here to protect the watersheds is one part of a long effort to do that. I'm going to move this off because it's echoing a little bit to me here. Okay, so I just want to tell you a little bit about what our initiative is. So it is the Lane County Watershed Bill of Rights. It's a citizen initiative. It is a Lane County measure, so it only affects Lane County, but it affects all of Lane County. And the idea there is that it would establish legal rights for the ecosystems of Lane County, in particular the watersheds of Lane County, to exist and thrive and flourish, and to be protected against harmful corporate activities that threaten the watersheds and our clean water. Okay, so for example, aerial spraying is an activity that that should not happen. It is basically it is a way of poisoning our environment and us. And that would be an activity that would ultimately lead to polluting our watersheds. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that this measure is meant to stop. It also, it's a rights-based initiative. We work on a paradigm called the rights of nature, that nature has inherent rights that are separate from just our ability to use nature for our human benefit. So it establishes rights for the watershed, but it also establishes rights for us as residents of Lane County, that we have a right to affordable, clean drinking water. Okay, very basic. We should all expect that, but that is part of what this would do. It also would require the county. It would be a county measure, so the county would have to enforce it. But it gives us as residents a right to seek legal action if the county doesn't enforce it as it should. And there's other provisions for how to, how to stop corporations from doing these activities, penalties if they don't stop polluting, and so forth. And that's basically it. We have materials in the back. We have brochures that talk about our work, and we also have some flyers that you can take with you. We've got we recently have qualified for the May 2026 ballot. So it seems like a long ways from now, but it's really not. It'll be here before we know it. And we are a very small group. Working on this without a lot of funding, and we will actually are all but certain to see enormous corporate opposition. We expect that we will be outspent 1,000 to 1, if not more. And so the only way that we can fight back against that to try to pass this is with help of more people. Okay, so that's why we're doing this. We'd love to have your help. And we have a kickoff event next month on the 15th of November at 6:30 p.m. at Play in Eugene. It's we've got a great band, Soul Vibrator. It's going to be a super fun event, and we hope to have a lot of people there. And there's little order sheets that you can take. There is also on the back of it a little bit about our measure, and then we also have another little flyer that has vote yes on measure 20-373. I'll say it again, 20-373. That is our initiative. That is what it'll look like on the ballot in May. And a little QR code that'll get you to our website. We would appreciate new volunteers with all kinds of things. Appreciate some money. Anything that you can do to help, we would appreciate it. So thank you for that. Let me briefly introduce our speaker. We are so honored to have former Representative Marty here. He has been a friend of our work since, since the beginning of our, when we started it. He grew up in rural Oregon, the child of educators and farmers. He has, spent 27 plus years, I think, in serving in the military, starting in '94 in I think the Army National Guard and then the Air National Guard. He, um, he went after, prosecuted sexual assault in Qatar. He went after war criminals in Bosnia, fought fires in Oregon, and then served as a legislator in Oregon, elected in 2018 and until 2022, doing the people's business. We really appreciate his help, and we're really glad to have him here tonight. And I think this is going to be a great event and a really interesting talk. So thank you, Marty. Yeah.
All right. Well, my first boss in the military made me swear off podiums because he felt like he shouldn't really have something between you and the audience. So, congratulations on getting on the ballot. That nature-based approach is a really important one that has had some notable successes in places as diverse as Hawaii and Montana. Montana, as you might imagine, these days is not a particularly progressive place, but one thing they all agree on was that in their constitution, they were going to have rights of nature. And so there was a Climate Kids lawsuit there that was successful based on their state constitution. And then Hawaii, I used to be on, power regulating committees, and, the Hawaii, delegation, when they come to these conferences, they're always like, we're so green, because we have all this wind and we have all this solar. And I was like, yeah, during the day, there's nobody greener, but at night you burn bunker oil, to generate power. So they're trying to figure out, how in the context of a, archipelagic state, how to decarbonize their power and transportation sectors, which is no small feat. So that was a successful lawsuit, again, a settlement in that case that was useful. So I think these kinds of initiatives really can make progress. As said, I'm a native son. I was actually born in student housing, something I tell every class I teach at the U of O. No longer student housing, tragically. It was in Westmoreland. And pretty quickly, my mom and my dad moved out to Triangle Lake area, Blatchley, Horton Road. And my dad, started organic farming before you could make any money at it, before it was a certification, before it had any additional things, but he wanted to, it was back to the land hippies thing. I used to joke, there were a lot of enthusiasms that ran through the back to the land hippies movement. Notably, we had neighbors who got a good deal on carrots and promptly turned orange. There was a great enthusiasm for turkeys, which coincided with an enthusiasm for black and white photography, which resulted in the Great Horton Turkey Slaughter, which was a series of glossy 8x10 pictures of a very, very messy and somewhat incompetently run turkey slaughter when they decided, turkeys, they're really not that bright, so they did pigs. Now, pigs have the opposite problem. They're too bright. So there was, the following year, a subsequent one. So, but amidst all of this radical experimentation, my dad did start organic farming. And, at the time, there were very few protections, and there still are very few protections in the logging sector. When I was regulating power, I was also working on water regulation. And we used to joke, you had to have a certain size to be a power company, right? A certain number of people had to come together because, working with power is dangerous, but anybody can run a water system. And that was the problem, is that my dad was the water master, which meant that he and some buddies, without a permit, dammed up this small stream, and created a gravity-fed system for 4 or 5 houses. And when something would go wrong, they would go and collect $20. There was no regular pay, there was no water treatment. In fact, one of the reasons I came along was apparently a deer had used the water to relieve itself. And then when they came out to test whether my parents would be suitable for foster parenting, well, the water didn't pass the test. But, at the time, in Senate, they passed rules that said that you had to protect drinking water streams from contamination, but you didn't have to protect non-drinking water streams. And ours wouldn't have been classified as a drinking water stream. It didn't have a formal system on it, right? You know, could they have done wells? Sure, they could have done wells, but it was a narrow valley. It was gonna be all the same water. And so they did this. And one of the things that happened is just down the road, there were a number of houses on a similar stream. And there was, they clear cut on one of the areas upstream and they sprayed it. And Hunter Meidel ended up dying. I think Jason Shell ended up dying. And there were two others that had rare urogenitary cancers after that, you know, boys at the time. And, you know, the response was from the companies essentially like, well, we followed the rules, right? But what you find is the pesticides don't, you know, they don't stay where you apply them. And so it's sad that people had to die, but one of the things we did finally get is some protection, not nearly as much as we need. And I'm grateful for all the work we continue to do that. So indeed, I got older. I joined the military because, like so many things, that's what my parents told me not to do. So, so I did it. I got to do a lot of really interesting things. Did most of my environmental work up in Alaska. So we were able to shut down a coal power plant there on the base and reroute some train tracks to the base that were going to allow for carbon efficient commuter service up to the Matsu Valley. Got to do a lot of really interesting, great projects. You know, I did that for a while. Always maintained an interest in what we call toxic torts, you know, the impact on people of these applications. And so eventually I went to Afghanistan, came back and decided I wanted to get involved in politics. So I was city club president a couple times. I got involved in the city budget committee, police commission, and eventually I was on vacation at the end of 2017. And Chris Wade, who was the local party chair at the time, called me up and said, "Do you want us to run for state representative?" And I said, "No, why would I want to do that? I've been lining up for city council, and that makes sense for me right now with, you know, relatively young children and that sort of thing. And besides, Kamala Sugar has been lining up for state office, and you should talk to her because she's a great candidate who, you know, lawyer, lived right up the road from me, you know, different background, but, you know, was going to be great. And she'd been doing all those state level committees." So he said, "Okay." So I checked in with Kamala. She's like, "Oh, yeah, I'm going to run." I said, "Great. Not my problem. You know, Phil's retiring, Barnhart's retiring, Kamala's going to do it." Got to finish my vacation and enjoy it. And then came back and Kamala called me up and said, "Do you know how little state representatives make?" I said, "Yeah, I think it's like 30 grand. She's like, 28,000. She said, "I make the money in my family and, you know, we got to do better than that." I said, "Okay." She said, "So I'm not running, you know, so you should run." I said, "Okay." So, you know, you take a deep breath and tighten your shoelaces and, you know, really you hit the doors, and start talking to people. And that was the way it was done. I ended up hiring a campaign manager who'd run a successful campaign, sadly against my mother for school board, but she was good. And we were sort of complementary personalities, but, you know, the joke for campaign managers is you hire them and then you work for them. And indeed, I worked for Becca for years until I left office. You know, we did the way you're supposed to do it. I had a contested primary and a contested general election. And between the two of them, I knocked on 11,000 doors. I think I had 500 individual donors separate from any PAC money or anything like that. And, you know, I think individually I raised about $160,000. And then there was about twice that came in from various PACs, including the Oregon League of Conservation Voters, which was very generous. But it was really interesting because when you knock on people's doors, this was a swing district, but it was really kind of a bimodal district, meaning it was close, but it had extremes from both ends. So I had the University District, which had a lot of very liberal people, but I also had parts of Lynn County that had some very conservative grassy farmers and stuff like that. And they used pesticides. And, you know, one of the reasons my family had moved from the valley out to Triangle Lake area was because of the field burning. And I remember having a conversation with one of my constituents in Lynn County, who was a grassy farmer, and he said, "Well, you got to understand, like, if we don't burn the fields, then we have to use the pesticides." And you know, I says, yeah, that's tough, but either way, the public's paying the price, for your business model. So you have to find a better way of doing that for you. And then we worked on getting them a new middle school building because that was one thing we could agree on. That's one thing you do when you're in the legislature is look for things that people can't agree on. But, so I did this campaign. It was very much grassroots. It was a lot of hard work, but it was really kind of enjoyable. In the end, we prevailed pretty well at the polls. I think I won by 14 points or something in the general. And then, you go to Salem. I go to Salem, and it's quite eye-opening. What you don't realize if you represent a swing district is everybody in leadership of the party is not from a swing district because they don't really have to campaign. They've been in office a while, so they don't even usually have primaries. So they don't knock on doors, and most of their fundraising is not from their friends and family. I had a memorable conversation, no, she'll remain nameless, but represented a very safe district. And he said, well, I asked them once in this primary I had for my first time I ran, my friends and family, and they gave me what they could, and I never want to have to ask them again. I asked them like 4 or 5 times in my first race alone. So it was sort of eye-opening to see, oh, okay, well, yeah, they still raise money, but they don't really talk to people. And I had, 500 donors, I think, individual donors in my first campaign. And then, sometimes they'd knock on doors or have town halls, but it really wasn't foremost on their minds. Their campaigns, they would raise some money, but their campaigns were largely funded by, people call them special interests. They're just interests, they're corporations or public employee unions or whatever, but they're organizations that have interests, and those interests may or may not align with your constituents. But if that's where you raise your money, to a degree, you are what you eat, in that. And it definitely, I certainly never saw anything like vote buying, but certainly it does buy access to a degree. And that was disappointing. It was also disappointing when I found out that the way you got to be a chair of a committee was you contributed more to your caucus than other people. So it was, pretty nakedly for sale in some ways. And the longer I served, the more I saw the real problems with the system. And so there were 3 I really wanted to talk about today. And I promise you, my story is only one of them, of the 3. But they all get back to ways in which the system does not reward the sort of interaction with regular folks that you would hope. I kind of naively thought, well, I'm a representative. My job is to represent, to go there, to talk to people and represent their interests in the legislature. So campaign finance reform I'll start with that. This has always been the top 3 I've had, but this is the one we've actually made some progress on. Why did we make progress on it? Well, there was a court decision that said the Constitution prohibited campaign finance reform or contribution limits in Oregon. That eventually got reversed midway through the campaign to reverse it. The initiative petition campaign to amend the Constitution. Nevertheless, the initiative petition passed with almost 80% of the vote. So this is one of the things where almost everybody agrees. Indeed, I had a young man who'd been in one of my classes come to me and say he wanted to work on things that people supported, but the political system had yet to. And I was like, well, here's a good start. So it passed with 80%. And there is a House District 17 primary as kind of the good example of this. And I used to say, it's no mystery that you can buy elections, but the surprise is often how cheap they are. So this was a contested Republican primary in a overwhelmingly then Republican district, House District 17 at the time. And it was Jamie Kate versus a guy named Scott Swart, and this was 2020. And it was around Lebanon. Jamie Kate, grass seed farmer, Scott Swart, I don't remember what his background was, I think, but it was something in natural resources, maybe timber industry. And you may remember this group called Timber Unity, right? And they were very big. Their logo was suspiciously like my logo, and they got mad at me about that. And I said, I had my logo first. I was here before you. But, I had trees and stuff. Mine aren't getting cut down, I'm sorry. And they backed Scott. And I don't know what happened, but there was a major employer in Lebanon, a battery factory, Entech is the name. And, I wasn't really paying that much attention because it was COVID and we were trying to deal with a bunch of things. But after the election, we saw that Jamie had won, and we were kind of shocked because in a competition to see who was the more conservative, usually the Timber Unity candidate was going to win that conversation. And so I went back and looked, it's all public in Oregon. You can go through Orstar and see who filed what. And indeed, there's this company, MTech, and the CEO had made, I don't want to misquote, but I think $50,000 in personal donations to Jamie's campaign, which in a primary is just a tremendous amount of money. This is not a district that has, a huge number of voters. And so, he basically bought the election, and it was really awkward because I was like, well, Jamie's going to win and she seems like a nice person, but this company had a lot of problems with the Department of Environmental Quality. But I was like, well, it's always going to be won by a Republican, and I presume they would be industry friendly, but I went to Tina, who was the speaker at the time, and said, you wouldn't be doing anybody any favors if you put her on any of the natural resources committees, because, she'll have some inherent conflicts of interest and it'll look terrible. It looks like you can just buy an election. But I mean, that's what sure it'll look like. I mean, so, how much does a primary election cost in the time, 2020, it costs 50 grand, which is, if you're facing, $1 million penalties that seems like a good deal, to get somebody on your side. So, did they pass campaign finance reform? Yes. Is it good? Yeah, it's a start. I would say there is no magic bullet that's going to solve these problems. They basically adopted the federal limits. There are still a lot of loopholes that allow a lot of money moving around. I would say, I'll be quite honest, I've benefited from those. They had, like I said, I mean, my funding was about 1/3 of the total funding for my first race, which was a highly contested race. It was a targeted race. We spent, I think, almost $500,000. And, we were able to move large blocks of money late because there's no campaign finance restrictions in place. There still aren't. They don't come into effect until 2028, I think. But it's not great, right? And as it turns out, the poll was somewhat misleading. It showed me down, I think, 8 points, and I won by, 14 or something. So it was just a bad poll, but it was a ton of money at the end. It's what got me on TV and did that sort of thing. And so, you might legitimately say, but one of the things I took away from that was, so who do you cultivate? Do you cultivate the CEOs, or do you knock on a lot of doors? Well, I can tell you what's more time efficient. Let's talk to the CEOs, right? I laughed because my biggest donor ever, individual donor, was $5,000. And, here's Jamie multiplying that by 10. And mine was a retired teacher. So campaign finance reform, it's a start. I think there's still a lot you need to do. There's a conversation about public financing. Portland has it to a degree, and mostly that says if you agree to accept a much lower cap on donations, then the city will match it. I did a back of the envelope calculation on how much it would take to implement that statewide. It was under $100 million, which sounds like a lot, but in the context of a state budget that I think is over 30 billion now, it would be a small price to pay to do that. So I tend to support public financing elections. And the way that works is you get, I think in Portland you had to get X number of people to give you at least $5, but not more than $250. And you had to agree to a cap of $250 on any individual donation. And then they would match it 6-1. And that really can make a difference in your ability to reach people. And you do it the right way. I could not have knocked on every door in my district. There were 67,000 people in my district. I mean, I did my best, at 11,000 doors. And so, I tried to reach everybody I could, but, so you do need money to do that, but there are ways of doing it that are frankly cheap in compared to what you pay by not having. So campaign finance reform is the one we've actually started on. Open primaries are another one. We have what's called a closed primary system here. And so people are like, oh, well, what's wrong with that? The Democrats should get who they want and the Republicans should get who they want. Well, the largest party is non-affiliated voters, right? When you add them and the minor parties together, you get close to a majority of people who aren't Democrats or Republicans. And they mostly don't get to vote in these primaries. The good example of that is, I was out at the end of, beginning of 2023, but in the 2022 election, I was running for judge, which I didn't win, but Charlie Conrad was running and as a Republican, and after the gerrymandering of the district, he won easily. Charlie was not as conservative as we thought, but I would say, a reasonably moderate conservative. He'd worked in public service a lot, so he believed in that there should be a government, which seems radical in some Republican circles now. But he'd always been clear that he was a pro-choice Republican, and he was actually on the health committee, and they were considering a reproductive rights and transgender rights bill. And he said, well, he's talked about this in some of my classes now and publicly as well. He was kind of was trying to figure it out, but at the end he said, look, I've got to be true to myself and to my voters. And I promised them I was pro-choice and wanted good reproductive health services for everybody. And that's what this means. And indeed, in his district, if that was the only issue on the ballot, that would pass. So Charlie voted for it, and it passed. He got immediately primaried by Darren Harvick in the Republican primary in 2024. Because it's a closed primary and non-affiliated voters don't get to vote, he lost 19 to 81%. So he only got 19% of the Republican vote. Why is that? Because the pro-life Oregon had come out against him and basically poisoned the waters against him. There was just no way he could win in that primary. Now, if you'd had a top two primary, he absolutely would have been in the top two. So to me, that kind of illustrates the way that these closed primaries really do frustrate the will of the voters. I understand there's an effort going on right now. I think they're gathering signatures to try to get that one on the ballot as well. Overwhelmingly, yes, you'll end up with a Democrat and Republican on the ballot, but in some of the Portland districts, you'll end up with two Democrats. And what it does is it encourages people to get out and encourages a degree of moderation. If what you're trying to do, you can cultivate the moderates in your district, and then it also really incentivizes you to work together with people across the aisles, because then it becomes less an issue of your party label and more of whether you actually do represent your district. Yeah, so closed primaries are a primary driver of polarization. All right, so nonpartisan redistricting. Oregon technically has nonpartisan redistricting, and this is where I really differed from my colleagues. It already says you're not supposed to consider party affiliation when you do redistricting, the decennial redistricting after the census. So in 2021, you may remember that we had this thing in 2020 called the pandemic, and so the redistricting happened in the next session anyway, but they were very, very late. It was the end of the first Trump administration. People were not a big believer in the census, so the data didn't come in until after we adjourned in the summer of 2021. And so they did special sessions to do it. So, it gets interesting because although it is supposed to be nonpartisan, it is done by the legislature. Other places have a commission system where the commission recommends it and then the legislature adopts it. And so it gets really interesting because, your perspective on this, what happened to me was, so from my perspective, I got summoned to military duty in, September of 2021. They were just getting started for the special session and doing some things. And I went into a meeting before I went on orders, and they said, this is the proposed map. You're going to be in a district that's plus 10 registration advantage. And I've been in a district, I think, with a single digit registration advantage, depending on what you're doing. And so I was like, okay, we're not supposed to consider that, are we? Like, well, no, but everybody wants to know. And I was like, okay. And then I looked more carefully, and they had divided the campus up of the University of Oregon. One of the other things that says in the law is you're not supposed to consider party registration, and you're supposed to keep together communities of interest. There's always a lot of debate about what a community of interest is. But I would say at least the main campus of the University of Oregon is a community of interest, right? They're all university affiliated, right? They managed, so in Oregon, there's 2 House districts to every Senate district. So they had managed to divide the main campus, not even talking about North UG, Autzen and that sort of thing. But the main campus itself up into not just 3 different House districts, but 3 different Senate districts. That takes some doing. I mean, you really have to be thoughtful about it. And so what I did was, I went to my constituents and said, look, you deserve to be your community of interest. You deserve to be represented by somebody who will represent your interests. And I think it violates the Oregon law and constitution to do this. And so I organized them to go testify. Ironically, I didn't get to vote on it because I was in military duty. But we organized everybody to go do it. And in the preliminary hearing on the bill, I think we had over 100 pieces of testimony submitted, dozens of people testified, and in the end, they said, well, we can't do this. So what happened next depends on your perspective. From the Senate perspective, there was always a backroom deal going on. And that deal was going to be the federal map. We got another congressional seat, so we're gonna have 6 instead of 5, and so they had to sort of divide up the state to do that. And the question was it going to be a 4-2 map, so 4 Democrats, 2 Republicans, which would more or less reflect the registration patterns in the state, or was it going to be what's called a 4-1-1 map? So 4 safe Democratic seats, 1 safe Republican seat, and 1 swinging seat. And the deal that was made was that the Republicans were going to get another state Senate seat in Lane County on the state redistricting in exchange for that what is now CD5, Congressional District 5, which is the swinging one for that. And now it's got Janelle Bynum in it, but for the first time they did it. It had Lori Chavez-DeRemer, who is a Republican. Now it's held by a Democrat. Yeah, so that's sort of the deal that was, nobody will swear to it because that would be improper, but that was the deal that was going on the Senate side. From my perspective, it went from, I object to a map that gives me a 10-point advantage because it divides up the campus in a way that I felt was impermissible. The next map I have has only my neighborhood in Eugene drawn out in a at least plus 10 Republican district that includes places like Junction City, Blue River, and Cottage Grove. And I was like, we're like a South University neighborhood. Like, these are wonderful places. I enjoy being there, but we're in no way a community of interest with them, in the South University kind of area. So nevertheless, I wasn't there, and they did that. Where I differ from some of my colleagues is there are some people that my current congressional representative Val Hoyle has said in public that she believes that they should pass nationwide legislation for nonpartisan redistricting, and I disagree with her. So we get this California-Texas problem now, which is, Texas decides that despite the fact that nothing has changed on their congressional map, they're gonna redistrict so that 5 more seats go to Republicans, and at the president's urging. And so California responds with a ballot initiative, which will temporarily reverse their nonpartisan redistricting, put 5 more Democrats on there. And I think Indiana, Virginia, there's some other place, Florida, are all thinking about doing a midterm redistricting. It's very difficult. We should not do that in Oregon. There's been some talk about, here's the maps you could draw for 6. It's like, look, Oregon law says that you're not supposed to do that. So you can change the law. I thought it was funny because when the Republicans sued against the district map that gerrymandered me out of office, one of the things they said is, well, we're the legislature, we get to change the law. I was like, to a degree, that's true, but you have to be overt about changing it. You can't just pretend that what you did meets the law when it didn't. And indeed, they have not. So, I think in some sense Val is correct that, it would be most desirable if they did a national nonpartisan redistricting law. I think if the Democrats take the House in 2026, there might be a possibility to do that. That I think each party will have been sort of bitten by that, and maybe they'll finally come to their senses and pass something reasonable. or at least some more restrictions on this midterm redistricting, which doesn't make a lot of sense. And, what's the advantage of that? Well, you represent a community of interest, and then you have an incentive to get out and talk to your people. So these are not, the sole solution to the problem. I would say there are some self-inflicted things that the legislature could do. I think one of the things that would happen is people say, well, when can you pass a bill? Well, we adopt internal rules that really make it, your bill is only alive for about 5 weeks at the beginning of the legislative session and the long session, because we adopt these internal rules that prohibit us from doing that. And then at the end of the long session, your bill dies and you don't get to work on it really until the next session. And I think, there's some simple things they could do, like say bills don't die at the end of the long session. You can keep working at the short session, because then there'll be an incentive to keep working them and to come to some good compromises and make people go out and talk to people and get testimony and that sort of thing. We already do it for fairly big legislation. Cap and trade have a lot of attention. There's some other things too. Every institution, develops a modus vivendi, a way of getting along, a way of living. And there's some really terrible things that the legislature's done. Frankly, they buy off votes with what's called the Christmas tree bill and the lottery bond bill. And these are often terrible public policy. They often are projects that are certainly necessary to somebody's perspective, but they're not ever subjected to any kind of rigorous thing. They're designed to compensate people whose districts lost out on some policy by giving them a nice project in their district. Don't get me wrong, I went to bat just like everybody else, but I had a lot of mixed feelings about, the fact that, for instance, total sports gambling in Oregon, in the US is now over $150 billion a year. And you can see the scandals that are erupting. The lottery, when we shut down the lottery during the video poker during COVID, we lost 80% of our lottery revenue. There's just lots of ways that the system is greased by things that are at least undesirable and possibly corrupt. But honestly, if you get the bones right, things start to follow. People start having conversations about what makes sense and what is a better way to represent people rather than special interests and inside interests. So hopefully that wasn't too long. I'm a former politician, so you wind me up and I'll talk forever.